Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes and then start the webinar. So sit tight. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to give it one more minute and then get started. Thank you. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. Welcome to our webinar called Local Solutions to Global Challenges. This webinar is part of an ongoing collaboration between our cities and the county to better understand, prepare for, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And today we're going to be going over just that with the help of our friends at the CLEO Institute. Next slide, Caitlin. Here you'll see today's speakers. I'm Megan Houston. I'm the director of Palm Beach County's Office of Resilience, and I'll be introducing the Coastal Resilience Partnership of Southeast Florida. Following me, we'll have Olivia Collins, the director of programs at the CLEO Institute, and she's going to present on global climate change and how it's affecting South Florida. After Olivia, we'll have Lindsay Naratka, who will dive in further to explain the details of the CRP's Joint Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment Project. Lindsay is the Sustainability Manager for the City of Boca Raton. And finally, we'll have Rebecca Harvey, the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Boynton Beach, and she's going to facilitate a questions and answers session where we hope that you all ask us lots of engaging, challenging questions, and this is really a webinar for you all, so please, please do take us up on that offer. With that said, we're going to roll into some of the housekeeping items for today. We are recording this webinar and it will be available for attendees to review for about 1 month after the workshop. Also, to ensure that we have the best sound quality as everyone's dialing in and connecting, we are going to mute the audience for the duration of the webinar. However, we'd still like to get a feel for who's in the room and who you all represent. If you don't mind, please type your name and organization in the chat box window now so we get a sense of who we're connecting with today. Finally, we will be answering questions from the audience at the end of today's workshop. Please type your questions into the same chat box along the way. We're going to do our best to respond to everyone after the presentations are complete. If you think of a question after the workshop, please feel free to reach out to us via phone or email. We're going to be sharing our contact information at the very end. Next slide. Okay, great. As I mentioned, this workshop is part of an ongoing collaboration between our cities and the county. Today's workshop attendees represent stakeholders from Boca Raton, Boynton Beach, Delray Beach, Highland Beach, Ocean Ridge, Lantana, Lake Worth Beach, and Palm Beach County. These 7 municipalities that you see colored in the map, along with the county, are members of this group called the Coastal Resilience Partnership of Southeast Palm Beach County, which we refer to as the CRP. So why did we all join and why did we form? A couple of years ago, these southeastern cities and the county, the resilience and sustainability leads from these jurisdictions started to meet to discuss some shared issues and concerns. Things like, we know we have similar physical, geographic, and social characteristics being living and working along the water. We share this 20-mile stretch of intracoastal waterway, and we're starting to experience the similar climate change impacts and threats. Things like sunny day flooding, coastal erosion, changes in rainfall and lightning, extreme storm events. At the same time, we are also concerned about our community's vulnerability to extreme temperatures, storm surge, and saltwater intrusion. Yet, despite all of these challenges and concerns, we collectively did not have a comprehensive local assessment that would help inform how we should be planning and thinking about our future. So in 2019, the group officially formed the CRP using a Florida DEP Resilient Programs grant to help us join forces and offset the costs of forming this CRP. And we knew that our first project, we wanted to have a joint climate change vulnerability assessment done. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So this year we're using a second DEP grant to offset the cost of doing the actual CCVA, as we call it, the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. We're also doing outreach programs such as the workshop today. So thank you, Florida DEP, for helping fund this. And the reason that we're working together collectively to complete this larger vulnerability assessment rather than have 7 or 8 piecemeal projects is that we're able to reduce individual costs, avoid duplication, leverage these grant dollars, and a special shout out to the City of Boynton Beach for acting as our grants manager on this project. And most importantly, we're able to build synergy and consistency in thinking about and assessing our vulnerability, developing the adaptation strategies, and working together across boundaries to solve our problems. So we're just going to highlight some of the CCVA aspects here before Lindsay will talk about it in more detail later. A CCVA is a study of how current and future climate variations will impact our local assets. For our area that we're studying, we expect the assessment will consider the vulnerability of people, property, water and transportation infrastructure, critical facilities, economic resources, and natural resources within this area. Lindsay's going to explain exactly what the CRP is studying a little later and who we are working with to complete the CCVA. But the main thing we want you all to think about or to resonate right now is that we are going to use the CCVA to inform future investments, which will lead to more effective adaptation planning across jurisdictional boundaries. That's really what it's all about: team collaboration, informed planning, and better investment strategies. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Olivia from the CLEO Institute to explain what exactly we're experiencing in South Florida and how we can act locally to solve the climate crisis.
Thank you, Megan, for the introduction. Just share my screen. Great. So good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure for CLEO to be a part of this collaboration. As Megan said, my name is Olivia Collins, and I'm the Director of Programs for the CLEO Institute. And today I'm just really going to present a brief and basic overview of the climate crisis, the causes, some of the main impacts that we're experiencing in our region in Florida, and what some of the solutions are from a policy standpoint. So in case you're not familiar, the CLEO Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Miami, but we now have offices in Orlando and Tallahassee. And we are primarily focused on climate change, education, and advocacy. So all of our programs and our trainings and our workshops are focused on helping people connect the dots on climate change, but also better understanding how they can take action at home as well as in their community. So before we begin, I just want to poll the audience really quickly, just to kind of gauge your climate change knowledge. So if you look at your screen, you can take a few seconds to answer that question. We can get an idea of what the knowledge is from our audience today. So what is your general level of knowledge about climate change? Great, give you a few more seconds. I'm going to share these results really quickly. So it looks like the majority of you have some knowledge about climate change, which is great. And I'm hoping that with what I present today, that some of you can learn something new. So for the sake of saving on my bandwidth, I'm going to stop my video while I do my presentation. So this is an image that I'm sure you're all familiar with, planet Earth. This picture was taken in the early 70s and really helped launch the environmental movement. But when I look at this image, I don't think about saving planet Earth, because I know that planet Earth has been here for millions of years, and I know it's probably going to remain for several million more. But what I look at and I see is all of the natural resources that the Earth provides free of charge to us are not only essential to our survival, but they're also critical for our quality of life. And when I look at climate change as a threat multiplier, I see it threatening our quality of life. And that's really what I want to kind of talk about today. So we know that when we talk about climate change, it's a highly politicized issue, and we know there's a lot of misinformation out there in the media. But I just want to begin the presentation by mentioning that there is a scientific consensus around climate change. So we know it's real, we know it's happening, and we know it's caused by us. 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming that we're seeing today is largely due to human activity. When we talk about human activity, we're really referring to those industrial activities, transportation, our agricultural system, everything that's raised the carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So the problem that we're seeing today is that we have too much greenhouse gas buildup in our atmosphere as a result of burning fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. So we are still very largely dependent as a planet to meet our energy needs on oil, coal, and gas. And when we burn these fossil fuels, we emit a lot of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, fluorinated gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and greenhouse gases are heat trapping gases. And that's really what's leading to the climate crisis that we're experiencing today. This is probably the most scientific slide that I have in my presentation, but it's really important to understand the greenhouse effect in order to understand what's causing climate change. So in a balanced world, the greenhouse effect is a good thing. It helps provide what's referred to as our Goldilocks climate on planet Earth. If we didn't have the greenhouse gas effect, the planet would probably be a frozen tundra. So very simply put, the energy coming down from the sun arrives in the form of light. It comes through the atmosphere, and you see these little squiggly yellow lines. Some of that energy is reflected right back into space. You see the ice here is reflecting it back into space, but a lot of that energy is absorbed by the planet. And when it's released in the form of energy. And typically, like I said, when it's balanced, the incoming energy is equal to the outgoing energy. That heat energy that's rising from the planet, some of it goes back into space, but a lot of it gets trapped in the atmosphere by the greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. And if you can imagine, it creates sort of like a blanketing effect However, because we're emitting so many excess greenhouse gases, that blanketing effect is getting thicker and thicker and radiating more heat back toward Earth. And that's why we have global warming. This is a graph that we've sort of reconstructed from NASA that shows carbon dioxide levels going back 400,000 years. So as you can see in the past millennia, we've seen a lot of variation. But the one thing is that we've never seen is our parts per million of carbon dioxide going above 300. Starting in the Industrial Revolution in late 1850s, late 1800s, I mean, and then again, around 1950, we surpassed 300 parts per million. And now today, the current level is 413 parts per million. So you can definitely see that we're no longer in a trend. We're definitely in uncharted territory and basically conducting an experiment for the first time on planet Earth. And this graph I like to use because it helps dispel the myth that we're in a natural climate cycle when it comes to climate change. If we were to superimpose temperature on carbon dioxide levels, we can see that there's definitely a direct correlation. And the dips that we see in this graph where there's low carbon dioxide levels, these are equivalent to ice ages in the past. And then when we superimpose sea level rise, we also see that there's a direct correlation. So what's happening now is the Earth is getting hotter, right? We are experiencing global warming. This is a great time series graph from NASA showing from the late 1800s to today how the planet has warmed in a visual way. And just pay attention to some of the poles as we move toward 2019. As you can see, the poles are also getting warmer at a much faster rate than the rest of the world. So before we get into some of the main climate crisis impacts, I'm going to poll the audience again. And this time we just want to sort of gauge what your experience is with climate impacts. So have you seen any impacts of climate change in your community, such as sunny day flooding, storms, extreme heat? Take a few seconds to answer that poll. Let's share the results. So I'm not surprised to see that the majority of you have seen multiple impacts, and this is something that I'm going to discuss, especially since Florida is one of the most vulnerable states to the impacts of climate change. So as I mentioned earlier, when we looked at that time series, we can see that the poles were heating up faster than the rest of the world. And that's really important to notice because that's where most of Earth's ice is, right? And what's happening to Earth's ice as global warming is in effect is that it's melting at an unprecedented rate. There are two types of ice. There's land ice, which refers to our ice sheets and our glaciers, and there's sea ice, which refers, of course, to frozen seawater and icebergs. And as both of these ice melt, it's triggering different reactions with climate change. So when land ice melts, it contributes to sea level rise. When sea ice melts, it does not contribute to sea level rise. And that's because the sea ice displaces the volume of the water. So when it melts, it doesn't contribute to the rise of the water. However, when we lose our sea ice, which you see in the image on the right-hand side, comparing the 1980s to 2016, this is Arctic sea ice. The Arctic sea ice helps reflect some of that incoming sun energy that I talked about earlier back into space. So when it shrinks, we have less of that ability. What happens is more dark ocean is exposed. That means that more of that heat is absorbed by the ocean gets warmer, more ice melts, and that's referred to a positive feedback loop, but there's really nothing positive about it. So as I mentioned, the planet is getting warmer, but the oceans are also warming at an alarming rate. So far, our oceans have absorbed more than 93% of all excess heat that's been caused by greenhouse gas emissions. And through the carbon cycle, our ocean also absorbs carbon dioxide in a natural way. However, because we're emitting so much excess carbon dioxide, our oceans absorb more than 1/4 of that carbon dioxide every single year, and that's leading to ocean acidification And that's also causing oxygen concentrations to decline in the oceans. And of course, all of these different issues are having significant impacts on our marine life. So if we start with coral reefs, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which is several thousand miles long. It took millions of years for it to become what it is today. But unfortunately, because of warming ocean waters, the Great Barrier Reef has experienced several bleaching events in the last decade. And actually this year, the reef is facing one of its most widespread bleaching events. So bleached coral can bounce back, but when it's made more vulnerable, it becomes even more difficult for a stressed environment to bounce back. So it doesn't mean automatically that the coral is dying and dead, but it is very difficult for coral reefs to bounce back from bleaching events. And when we look at the Florida Keys, we only have 10% remaining of our original reef system. So we know that coral reefs not only provide habitat for thousands of different marine creatures, but they're also the backbone of the economy in Florida, where we depend on tourism for snorkeling and diving, and people come here to see our reefs. But also a lesser known fact about coral reefs, just like mangroves, is that they're our first coastal defense against storm surge. And so when we lose our reef, we also lose that ability to protect our communities. So when I talked about land ice melts, we know that that contributes to sea level rise, but the other driver of sea level rise is thermal expansion. And that's really referring just to the fact that when water heats up, it expands, the water molecules swell. And I'm sure living in Florida, many of you have already said that you've experienced different impacts from climate change. I'm sure you've seen flooding events across Florida. We know that by 2050, which is 30 years from now, we could expect to see 2 feet of sea level rise. However, by the end of this century, we really can't rule out 8 to 10 feet. Predicting sea level rise is not easy. There are a lot of different variables involved. That's why there's always a range when we look at sea level rise moving forward. However, if we saw 8 to 10 feet of sea level rise, we know that a lot of our communities in Florida would be underwater. So this is a picture that was taken in 2017 in Delray Beach during king tides and sunny day flooding. These are natural occurrences and they're very predictable. They happen in September, October, November of every year when we experience higher than normal tides. But because the seas are rising, these tides are becoming even more of a nuisance. Of course, not just for homeowners who are experiencing flooding as a result of this, but it impacts everything from our infrastructure and our sewage management as well. This is another picture that was taken last year in Lantana during high tides, and you can see that the parking lot is completely underwater. So the message here really is that Florida's cities are at risk from climate change, more so than almost any other state in the United States. So we have a lot to lose, and that's why we have a lot of work to do in order to sort of improve not only our mitigation strategies, but also our adaptation strategies so we can protect our home long-term from the impacts of climate change. One of the issues, of course, that we're facing that I just discussed was flooding. As we all know, there's a lot of property on the coast in Florida. It's, you know, it's one of the most beautiful parts of the state, and a lot of people want to live there, and that's where the population tends to be concentrated. However, by 2050, we could lose more than $20 billion of existing property. And because of high tides and flooding, we could, we know that there's more than $150 billion of coastal property that's also at risk. So this is really, it's not only a humanitarian issue, but it's also an economic issue for Florida. Another issue related to sea level rise is saltwater intrusion. And we're already seeing communities across Florida experiencing this. Florida has very unique geology, and we basically sit on porous limestone. So when we are experiencing sea level rise, it's not just coming in from the coast, but it's also coming in from underneath, and that's threatening our freshwater supply. We know that a lot of South Florida gets its drinking water from the Biscayne Bay Aquifer. So what we're looking at is millions of people depending on one source of drinking water. Now we know that we'll have drinking water. It's just a question of how expensive is it going to become moving forward if we have to remove salt water. And of course, Something that we like to talk about a lot at CLEO is, the implications for our more vulnerable communities when it comes to the impacts of climate change. And as the cost of water goes up, this will certainly impact our low wealth communities more than our more affluent communities who can afford to pay the rising costs of water. Another issue that we're very familiar with, we've just entered into hurricane season starting on June 1st. And it's already been a very active hurricane season. I think we have the third storm currently causing some of the rain that we're seeing here in South Florida. As I mentioned earlier, the air is getting warmer, and warm air can hold more moisture. So we're going to be seeing heavier rainfall. We've already seen heavier rainfall across the United States. Warmer water acts as fuel for hurricanes. So we're not going to see necessarily more hurricanes, just bigger, stronger hurricanes, and hurricanes that accelerate a lot faster. And of course, if we see larger rainfall and bigger storms, a storm surge will also be a lot bigger. This is Hurricane Irma from 2017, which was a monster storm. And while Hurricane Irma was making its trajectory toward the Caribbean and Florida, the water was 5 degrees warmer than average. And again, Hurricane Michael, which hit the Panhandle in Florida, devastated some of the communities there, some of which are still recovering a year later. And when we look at the trajectory here, the waters were also warmer than average. And I was on a webinar yesterday where we looked at, what some of the projections are for the 2020 hurricane season, expected to be a very active season because sea surface temperatures are warmer than usual. However, an active hurricane season doesn't necessarily mean these hurricanes are going to make landfall in the United States. It just means that we're going to see a lot more storms. We also know, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the climate crisis is having major impacts on our economy, and not just in Florida, but across the United States. This graph helps us see how there's been an uptick in billion-dollar disasters since the 1980s that are related to weather and climate events. We know that recovering from large hurricanes can be extremely expensive. The wildfires in California also cost billions of dollars. So this is something that cities and states and the federal government really have to start taking into account as we move forward and start to experience more extreme weather events. And in Florida in particular, our state is dependent on tourism. So people come to Florida to experience our beach, to snorkel, to dive, and because of extreme weather events, extreme heat, beach erosion, all of these different climate impacts are going to have a major impact on our tourism industry. And by the end of the century, the UCS estimates that we could see a loss of almost $200 billion a year as a result of climate impacts. The climate crisis is also affecting national security. I had a little video here, but wasn't playing very well, so I'm not going to play it for you, but I'm just going to put this statement up here. In 2015, the Department of Defense released a report that discussed the different implications of climate change. And basically the report found that climate change is a security risk because it degrades living conditions, human security, and the ability of governments to meet the basic needs of their populations. And in a way, that statement says it all. But also, a lot of our army bases are coastal, and so military all across the United States are trying to figure out ways to cope with sea level rise and protect a lot of their infrastructure as well. One of the biggest impacts that climate change is having is directly on our health. The World Health Organization put out a statement several years ago saying that climate change is the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And that's because it impacts every single aspect, from vector-borne diseases to our access to food and water. The first thing I want to discuss was extreme heat. I think this is something we're all familiar with in Florida, but it's important to kind of take a closer look at what we can expect to see and what we're already experiencing now. So this graph is showing more summer days, more hot summer days in West Palm Beach. And we can definitely see there's a huge upward trend since the 1970s, right? And what does that mean for our vulnerable communities? The elderly, those of us who don't have access to AC, those of us who depend on public transportation and are more exposed to heat. These are things that we have to take into consideration when we think about climate impacts. And this is another graph just showing the number of danger days that West Palm Beach could see by mid-century. And it's almost half the year at above 105 degrees. So when we think about impacts, again, it hits our most vulnerable, and it can cause everything from heat stroke to respiratory issues. But anyone who has respiratory disease, asthma, or has heart or brain issues is more vulnerable to exposure to heat. And there's also the issue of vector-borne diseases. We know that as the globe is getting warmer, the range of mosquitoes is expanding. We know that when it's hotter, mosquitoes tend to feed more, they tend to reproduce faster. So we're seeing a spike in vector-borne diseases. And just a kind of a staggering statistic to me is just that heat causes more deaths in the US than any type of natural disaster combined. And again, when we think about heat, we have to think about our outdoor laborers in our agricultural industry, our construction workers. How are we going to put policy together that protects them from rising heat? But also recreation will have to change. A few years ago, there were several marathons across the world that were canceled because of heat waves that were happening across the world. So heat can definitely impact, not only our health, but also our lifestyle. Another issue related to heat is the influence that it has on air quality and pollution. So smog is created, or ground level ozone is created, when heat combines with volatile organic compounds that come out of our cars and our chimneys and all of the industry. When those two combine, it creates ground level ozone, and that's not to be confused with ozone in the atmosphere, which helps protect us from sun radiation. Ground level ozone is basically smog. It's basically pollution. So as our planet gets hotter, we're going to see more ground level ozone. And again, anyone who has asthma, any of our vulnerable populations stand to lose the most as our air quality goes down. And the WHO even said that in 2016, nearly 1 million children died across the world from respiratory infections that were caused by air pollution. And there has been an increase in asthma among children in the US as well. Climate change also impacts our food systems and migration in a major way. So, extreme weather events like floods and droughts can significantly disrupt agriculture. On the right-hand side, there's a map, and in purple is what's referred to as the Central American Dry Corridor. And in 2018, this area experienced a massive drought that was exacerbated by climate change, and the region lost 80% of some of its main crops. And that's what led to the mass migration caravan that we saw that was highly discussed in the news. Now, some people were certainly escaping violence in the region, but one thing that the media wasn't covering as much was the fact that there had been this drought and that climate change was one of the drivers of this drought. And this is just a glimpse of something we can expect to see a little bit more in the future, is climate migration and climate migrants. There's going to be a lot of internal migration in the continents across the planet. And this is going to cause huge economic issues, but also major shifts for populations. And I think over the next decades, the US can probably expect to see a lot more migrants trying to seek asylum in the United States as well. And finally, this is a topic that's being discussed increasingly in the climate crisis field, is mental health. All of the different impacts I just mentioned can have a huge impact on our mental health. And this is, again, especially true for our vulnerable populations who don't have access to healthcare, who don't have access to secure housing or transportation. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, suicide attempts tripled, and studies have shown that sexual assault and domestic violence have increased against women in the wake of disasters. This is something we're going to think about, especially in terms of policy, on how we address these issues to make sure that not only everybody is supported, but our most vulnerable populations are supported through climate change. So I've talked a little bit about the impacts, and I want to send one more poll out to kind of ask about how have you felt impacted personally by the impacts of climate change. So I'm just going to launch this poll. We're just trying to see if you felt personally impacted. And I'm assuming if a lot of you come from Florida, that the answer will likely be yes. Give you a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to end that and share the results. So just as I would imagine, most of us have been impacted to some degree by the impacts of climate change. And that's really not surprising, again, given that we live in Florida and we are one of the most vulnerable states to climate change. So the good news is we do have solutions to climate change. And we put these in two different buckets at CLEO. On the left-hand side, we look at mitigation, which is really getting to the root cause of the problem, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, moving away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy. And then on the right, we have adaptation. We know we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change. How are we going to adapt and provide safety and security for our residents and our coastal communities? So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of these. So one of the ways that we've come together as a planet has been through the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015 by lots of different countries across the world. And it was really putting together a path to a low carbon economy. But the ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I just want to point out that since pre-industrial times, our temperature has already gone up by 1 degree Celsius. And this is an important moment in our history. And while the Paris Accord is not a binding agreement, it certainly is a symbolic agreement and one that can help propel us forward as a planet, because we know we share one atmosphere, therefore we all have to do the work to fight the climate crisis. However, last year, the US withdrew from the Paris Accord. That withdrawal becomes effective this November 2020. And when we look on the right-hand side, we see, when we look at carbon footprints by country per capita, which is really per person, we can see that the United States is the largest emitter of carbon. And so when the largest emitter of carbon withdraws from the Paris Agreement, it's not only sending a signal to the world, it's also sending a signal to its own citizens that we're not really prepared to do the work to fight the climate crisis. And we're really, in that sense, we're moving in the wrong direction. That being said, right after the US announced its withdrawal, lots of different organizations, cities, businesses, colleges got together and started the We Are Still In movement, basically just stating that regardless of what the US wanted to do with the Paris Agreement, that they were going to do their part to stay inside and reduce their greenhouse gases. So there's still a lot of positive action going on, and a lot of that action is happening at the city level. So one thing we do know is that we do have alternative energy choices. We don't have to keep using fossil fuels to meet our energy needs. And what's interesting is that the private sector is also, paving the way and showing that there's a business case for going renewable. And over 190 global companies have made that commitment to go 100% renewable. And this is just a quick snapshot of some of those countries. And when the private sector gets on board and shows that there's a business case, that does help influence state and federal policy as well. One thing that we can do better as cities, of course, is figuring out how we can move smarter and more efficiently. We certainly need to electrify our fleet, but we also have to improve our public transportation in general so we can get more people off the road. We know that electric vehicle sales are on the rise. I believe Florida is one of the largest markets for electric vehicles. So from a personal standpoint, that's something that people can do. But certainly cities also have to figure out ways that we can build smarter, more green and efficient buildings. As we retrofit some of our infrastructure, we really have to do it in a way that we're thinking about our greenhouse gas emissions. And we like to say that ending the climate crisis really begins with cities. We know that cities are well poised to put forward really progressive climate policy, but in a way they have no choice. Cities are home to half of the world's population, and that's expected to be almost 70% by mid-century. Cities consume 70% of global emissions, and over 90% of all urban areas are coastal. So there's a lot to lose And therefore, there's a lot of work that cities can do to have a positive impact on the climate crisis. And that's really just by coming up with creative solutions from everything from transportation to infrastructure and social changes that we can make in cities, all of which have a really positive impact that can add up to creating global effects. And we've also seen that when cities lead the way, states and the federal government tend to follow suit. I'm just going to show you a very quick example of a case study of a city that's doing some really great things. I'm not going to go over this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's good to know that, you know, there are cities in Florida that are really taking the lead, and the city of Orlando is one of those cities in terms of their clean energy and energy efficiency policy. They have set a goal of going 100% renewable by 2050, and they found innovative ways of reducing their annual energy costs and emissions through retrofitting efforts and different policies that they've put in place. And they've also been doing this through their transportation sector. They would like to transition in 10 years to 100% alternative fuels, and they're about 80% there now. But also they're putting in place policies that provide safe and convenient access for pedestrians, public transit users, and cyclists, so that it encourages people to use those alternative modes of transportation. Another thing that we can do in cities is use the power of trees. We can never underestimate the power of nature to help fight the climate crisis. And this is something that we could possibly improve in most of our cities across Florida and the United States. We know that cities absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They also help with storm runoff, and they also absorb air pollution. I read recently that the city of West Palm Beach had put in place policies that were favoring shade trees, native shade trees over palm trees. So in their tree giveaways, but also in their parks department, when they were planting trees, they were looking at planting live oaks rather than palm trees. And one of the reasons is that a palm tree on average in a year can absorb about 1 pound of carbon dioxide, versus a live oak at a certain maturity can absorb more than 90 pounds of carbon dioxide. Trees also help reduce the heat urban island effect that we're experiencing in our cities as a result of all that concrete and radiated heat. And when we look at maps of tree canopy across our cities, we also see that our low wealth neighborhoods tend to have less tree canopy. So if we plant more shade trees, again, you know, trees are a benefit multiplier. The same way we say that climate change is a threat multiplier, trees have multiple benefits. And it's something that we should all integrate into our city planning and favor native shade trees over decorative trees like palm trees that don't have as much of a positive impact. When we look at climate solutions, the book Drawdown is it's really a great roadmap. It shows more than 100 solutions in their order of impact. And I'm just going to cover a few of those today from a policy standpoint. So these are the top 10 solutions that are highlighted in Drawdown. And today I'm really just going to look at refrigeration, reduced food waste, and rooftop solar. So the first one that's listed in Drawdown is refrigeration. So refrigerants that are used in air conditioners, fridges, freezers, anything that cools, uses hydrofluorocarbons. And hydrofluorocarbons were actually a replacement for CFCs in the 1980s, when we discovered that CFCs were causing damage to our ozone layer. We came up with a replacement, which was HFCs, without realizing that HFCs are an extremely potent greenhouse gas. They can trap heat 1,000 to 9,000 times more than carbon dioxide. And as we know, if it's going to be getting hotter across the planet, we're going to see an increased need for cooling. Therefore, this is something we need to tackle as soon as we can. Some states have already banned HFCs. There are appliances that you can buy that don't use them. You know, that's something that the state of Florida could do. I do know that there is bipartisan support in Congress to ban HFCs. And in the last energy bill that didn't pass, there was a bill related to banning and phasing out HFCs. So there is bipartisan support. It's something that's in the works. But Florida could also take the lead, and I do believe that there is support for that in the state of Florida as well. Another issue that we bring up at CLEO is food waste. So staggering statistic, if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter after US and China. When food goes to the landfill, it decomposes and it emits methane. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and it has a higher heat trapping capability than carbon dioxide as well. So we could come up with innovative solutions to incentivize businesses to donate their surplus food so it doesn't go to waste. Several states have policies in place. I know California diverts a lot of its food waste through a composting system that it has. Some countries have banned restaurants and large grocery stores from throwing out food, and they are forced to connect that food to needy places like local shelters. And so it's a win-win in the end. We're diverting food waste from the landfill, but we're also helping some of our citizens that are most in need and who don't have access to food. In the US, we waste about 30 to 40% of all of our food, and that's starting at the farm all the way to the consumer level. So not only is that devastating for climate change, but it's also valued at almost $200 billion a year. That's money that could probably be used elsewhere in education or innovative climate policies, perhaps. And of course, we can't not talk about solutions and mention solar. We know that renewable energies are an essential part of addressing climate change, and we really need to be moving away from the fossil fuel economy and toward renewable energy. Florida is the solar state. However, we have a lot of room to grow. Last year, solar was the fastest growing job sector in Florida, demonstrating that there's definitely an upward trend in the adoption of solar. However, I think we could do probably a lot more. We could advocate for more solar farms, but as we move toward a renewable energy economy, we also have to make sure that we're doing it in a just way. And that means making sure that our underserved communities have access to renewable energy as well. And it's not just the affluent communities. And that's because low-income households tend to pay a lot more of their income on utilities than higher income households pay. As I mentioned earlier, there's also adaptation that we have to put in place. And I think this is a large part of the climate change vulnerability assessment. And there is definitely a business case for adaptation. And it's something that we have no choice but to put in place if we want to, build resilience in our communities and stay where we are in the long term. Adaptation measures, there are lots of different ones. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I'm not an expert in adaptation by any means, but when cities put in place certain adaptation measures, they can decrease flood insurance premiums for their residents, and that can go up to 45% reduction. Cities can also enhance their municipal credit ratings, and a very famous recent study demonstrated that for every dollar we spend in pre-disaster mitigation, we save 6 in recovery costs in the future. One of the most common adaptation measures that we're familiar with, of course, are seawalls. We've seen them all over Florida. However, because of our enormous coastline, Florida is #1 in the most miles needed of seawalls, and that comes with a really high price tag of approximately $74 billion. However, seawalls do help protect our communities in the short and long term. Another adaptation measure is raising roads. We've seen this across Florida, definitely in South Beach it's been done. It is a very expensive adaptation measure, but it can potentially increase property values. In the photo that you see on the right-hand side, you can see a neighborhood that used to have chronic flooding, and now when they raise the roads, the flooding is no longer an issue. That being said, on the picture below, this is a gentleman whose house is right next to a street that was raised, and when it rains really heavily, some of that rain pours down toward his home. So when we think about these adaptation measures, we really have to be smart in how we implement them to make sure that they don't have a detrimental impact on our communities. And this is probably one of my favorite adaptation measures. Blue-green infrastructure can be expensive at the outset. However, it has multiple benefits and it tackles lots of different climate change impacts. So it has environmental, economic, and social benefits as well. We can improve our water quality, reduce flooding, we can reduce the heat that we're experiencing in our cities, improve air quality, and have more green spaces which again contributes to our quality of life for those of us that live in urban areas. And finally, another solution that CLEO supports is putting a price on pollution. We know that putting a price on carbon can help propel us quickly and reduce our emissions in a short period of time while we also implement other climate change solutions. I just like to emphasize there is no one size fits all solution for climate change. It's an enormously complex problem and therefore requires an interdisciplinary approach, a multi-pronged approach. We need all different kinds of solutions to tackle the climate crisis. And this is just one of them. And in the study that they conducted to look at what would happen if we put a price on carbon in the US, in 20 years, we could reduce our carbon emissions by 50% from 1990 levels. And we could add, almost 3 million jobs in the process. And it can be done in a way where it's not a tax, it's a fee and dividend system, which means some of that money goes back into the pocket of the American people. And finally, I would just like to mention that, as I said earlier, cities are really poised to take climate action and they have a lot of power to influence the climate crisis, but they're also just as vulnerable as they are powerful. And again, there isn't just one single solution. We're going to have to implement lots of different solutions and include a wide range of stakeholders in order to tackle the climate crisis. And I'd like to just leave you with this quote today: "The earth is what we all have in common. We cannot damage it without damaging those with whom we share it." So thank you again. I look forward to answering some questions at the end of the webinar. And if you'd like to follow CLEO, this is our social media handle, and that's our website. And again, we'll be sending all this information in a follow-up email as well. Megan, I don't know if you'd like to share your screen. I'm trying to unmute you, Megan, just a moment.
Hi, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Lindsay.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Olivia. That presentation was extremely comprehensive and really lays the framework for what we're going to be discussing now. So my name is Lindsay Roland Naranka. I am the Sustainability Manager for the City of Boca Raton. So before we get started, we do have one more quick poll question. If Olivia, you could pull that one up to see how familiar you are with what your communities are doing in regards to climate resiliency.
A few more seconds. End the poll and share the results.
All right, so we have quite a mix of familiarity and not so much with this group, which is what we are here to talk about a little bit. So this presentation is meant to give you all a bit of an update on what we are doing. The county, along with the cities of Boca Raton, Delray Beach, Boynton Beach, Lake Worth Beach, and the towns of Highland Beach, Lantana, and Ocean Ridge, have begun the process of conducting a climate change vulnerability assessment, or CCVA, as we'll refer to it from here on out. The consultant group, led by Collective Water Resources, brings together local expertise to complete this assessment. The CCVA launched in the spring and is anticipated to be completed in the spring of 2021. So the CCVA will identify climate threats, recognize important local assets, and determine risk and vulnerability of those assets to the threats. The results of the assessment will be used to inform adaptation strategies. As Megan Houston discussed at the beginning, we are approaching the CCVA as a region so that the adaptation strategies can be cohesive and collaborative across the region to increase the efficiency of adaptation and create resiliency regionally. We expect that the results of the CCVA will help to identify such strategies as developing adaptation action areas, and also to help us prioritize the strategies that we develop. Throughout the CCVA process, we will be working with our community stakeholders to gain insight on vulnerabilities and to communicate results. The final deliverable of the project will be an interactive platform for exploring those results. So the initial steps of the CCVA have included identifying the threats faced in the region and choosing assets of which to determine vulnerability and risk. From the perspective of this study, threats may fit the characteristics that are shown on this slide. They may be major hazard events or disruptions. They can have the potential to be influenced by projected changing conditions. They may be influenced by stressors, which can be both climate and non-climate related. The threats we are assessing can also impact our individual communities or our communities as a whole, as a region, or impact spatially explicit areas. For the purpose of the CCVA, the communities and consultants have selected 12 main threats, which include high winds, rainfall-induced flooding, harmful algal blooms, pest and disease outbreak, extreme heat, drought, wildfire, shoreline recession, tidal flooding, storm surge, groundwater inundation, and saltwater intrusion. As was mentioned previously, our threats are influenced by stressors. One major stressor impacting multiple threats is that of sea level rise. Tidal flooding, rainfall flooding, storm surge, saltwater intrusion, and shoreline recession can all be made worse by rising sea levels over time. The CCVA will use the regional sea level rise projections from the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact to assess these threats. The central task of the CCVA is to determine the vulnerability and risks faced by community assets and systems in the face of the threats identified. Vulnerability and risk are two related but separate concepts. Vulnerability speaks to the predisposition of assets to be adversely impacted by threats. This includes elements of the asset's exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Risk, on the other hand, takes into account the likelihood of the threat occurring or having a negative outcome, so encompasses both probability and consequence. The examples of these two homes pictured here may help illustrate the concept. While exposure to and probability of a threat such as tidal flooding or storm surge occurring may be the same, the properties differ in terms of their sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and the subsequent consequence of the event. The property on the right has a higher risk and higher vulnerability to storm surge than the property on the left. The assets being considered in the project will include critical facilities, water infrastructure, economic assets, natural resources, our people and cultural assets, property including residential, commercial, and public property, as well as our transportation and mobility systems. The results of the study will be visualized in the platform Excel Adapt by Fernleaf Interactive. These examples are from a study conducted in West Palm Beach and one in the Triangle region of North Carolina. The results will be geographically represented and demonstrate how looking at impact, adaptive capacity, probability, and consequence are used to determine vulnerability and risk levels at a spatial scale within communities and across the region. Once these results are complete, the next steps in the project will be to begin to develop adaptation strategies and a regional approach to implementation. Adaptation strategies will be considered both for individual communities as well as for the region, will include hard infrastructure as well as natural or green infrastructure, include structural and behavioral strategies, and consider many different paths for implementation, including policy language and initiatives. Also considered will be the cost estimates and potential funding mechanisms, and throughout the whole process, the team will be conducting outreach with staff and community stakeholders to gain information and prioritize strategies. Olivia spoke a bit in her presentation about links between climate and health. And we in the CRP think it's worth mentioning a little bit about the links between the current crisis with COVID-19 and the climate crisis. There are many articles written on this topic and much to unpack and consider. One point that is often made is the improvements in environmental quality that have been a result and reductions in greenhouse gases that have been occurring because of the slowdown in our economies. These improvements are expected to be short-lived, and economic shutdown is by no means a sustainable way to achieve environmental improvement. In fact, there is concern that the downturn in the economy could hinder long-term and sustainable actions such as the transition to clean energy. There are some positive insights related to the political and social response to the COVID crisis, however. Governments can take quick and decisive action, and people can make shifts in their behavior rather quickly. For example, prior to this crisis, we had not considered doing this workshop as a webinar, although doing so has allowed us to reach more people without the confines of the venue's space limitations and travel for participants. Unfortunately, it does mean you did not get the cookies we'd originally planned to provide, so we do apologize for that. We've also seen more recognition and appreciation for science and the ways in which we are interconnected as global societies. The major question will be, can we apply some of these insights and lessons to our response to the climate crisis? The current crisis, which was not anticipated, may help us to respond to the climate crisis, which we are able to anticipate. We've been able to see the impact of the crisis on our organizations, communities, and people, and thus better plan for the building the resiliency of our vulnerable populations and building resilient organizations as we choose our response to the climate crisis. So it is at this point in the presentation that we turn to you, our community partners, residents, and stakeholders, and ask for your help. So we do have one remaining poll question for you, if you can pull that up for me, Olivia. So the question is, do you want to continue to be involved with the CRP and climate resilience planning in Southeast Palm Beach County?
Give it a few more seconds. Okay, end the poll and share.
Excellent. So we do hope that you will choose to continue to engage with future outreach regarding the CCVA. Our next webinar update is anticipated for later in the summer. We will also be sending out a survey when the webinar ends, and we hope that each of you takes a few minutes to fill that out. So also to stay up to date with announcements and progress of the project, we ask that you sign up for the County Office of Resilience newsletter, and for any questions about the project, you can reach out to staff from your community or to the county. Caitlin Cusinata will be your main county contact, and I believe she will put in the chat box a direct link to sign up for that newsletter. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to attend this webinar today. I want to thank the CLEO Institute for their presentation and acknowledge our consultant group working on the CCVA, led by Collective Water Resources. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Harvey, the Sustainability Coordinator of Boynton Beach, who will be handling the Q&A. So if you have not done so already, you can also type some questions into that Q&A box for either the CRP or for the CLEO Institute. So thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Give me a quick thumbs up or...
Yeah, we can hear you, Rebecca.
Hi, Olivia. I would turn on my video too, but I have such a messy office that nobody wants to see. But nice to see you. Actually, I will. You're all gonna see my messy office. There we go. Thank you so much. I just wanna thank everyone for your engagement today, and thank you, Olivia and the CLEO Institute, for this partnership and for your very thorough presentation about all the climate crisis itself, the science, the impact, and what we can do as cities and as individuals. And thank you, Lindsay, for giving that great overview of what we are getting started here in Southeast Palm Beach County for the vulnerability assessment. I just wanted to make clear that you all were selected. We, as leaders of this initiative, we went through and selected organizations that we know and people that we know who we really want to keep involved. And it's so heartening to see that almost all of you said yes, that you want to stay involved in the process. Please feel free to type it either into the chat or send us an email afterwards if you know of other organizations in the area that should be in on this conversation, because we're sure we didn't think of everyone. So that's one ask. And I also wanted to just remind you that here on the call, you have a really unique opportunity. Not only do we have CLEO Institute, who's our regional expert on climate change education, we also have representatives from many of the cities and towns, as well as our consultants who are doing the vulnerability assessment. So that said, I think the questions are starting to come in. So I will turn to those. And please, note, some of you have noticed already that the settings in the chat are only going to panelists. The attendees don't see those. So if you have a question that you want everyone to see, type it into the Q&A box instead. So we've answered a few, and I believe you can see the answers that we've typed in as people were asking questions during the webinar. So I'm just going to start with the new questions here. Allison noted that she does what I just said. Yeah, so please, we're not going to change the setting in the chat, but please just type your questions into the Q&A box so people can see them. So we have a question from Lewis. Hi, Lewis. Merlin. Lewis is the organizer for Citizens Climate Lobby in Southeast Palm Beach County. And Lewis asks, is the current CCVA plan focused predominantly on adaptation? Will mitigation also be considered? And that is a great question. I was actually going to bring that up if nobody asked it. So you segued perfectly. I wanted to clarify that the answer is yes, that the CCVA plan is focused on, it's a climate adaptation plan, or it's a vulnerability assessment to then develop an adaptation plan. That said, many of the communities are also pursuing climate mitigation plans. And for those of you not as versed in the terminology, in climate change, we talk about mitigation, referring to mitigating the source of climate change, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whereas adaptation is preparing our communities, becoming more resilient to the inevitable impacts that, of course, there's a link between the two, because by mitigating, we can reduce the severity of those impacts. So for example, City of Boynton Beach, just in March, we passed our new climate action plan, which is a mitigation plan, and we set targets for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions 50% community-wide by the year 2035 and net zero by the year 2050. So we have that as a separate plan focused on mitigation. It deals with everything from our fleet vehicles to our buildings to community-wide solar promotion to trees and green space. It's very comprehensive. And so we're very excited to get kicking off with the vulnerability assessment to develop adaptation plans. Next question from Christina. What targeted actions are our county and region as a whole planning to do to minimize the effects of climate change on our region and county? This webinar, okay, yes. So exactly, this webinar provided great background information because we're at the beginning of this process. When you speak about our county and our region as a whole, there is, many of you probably know, and I believe Olivia mentioned it in her presentation, I think that we have the
Florida Compact. I didn't mention it,
okay.
no, but that's the first thing that came to mind when I saw that question.
Yeah, so maybe you want to speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the Southeast Florida Compact includes the 4 South Florida counties, and it provides guidelines, and it's a partnership to move forward with climate mitigation and adaptation. I can actually send you a link, and we can put that in the follow-up email if you want to read more about it. Every year, the Climate Compact meets and has, they rotate which county it's in every year. They have like a conference, if you will. Last year, I believe it was in the Keys, and I'm not sure where it's supposed to be this year because of the pandemic, but it's a way. Oh, it is? Okay. I don't know if they're going to do it online.
Megan and Caitlin on the phone.
Yeah, let me see if I can unmute her. I
don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if the decision has been made yet, if it's online.
I think Megan, you can go ahead.
Hi everyone. So we do have a climate summit, as Olivia mentioned, every year. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we decided it was best to postpone the climate summit that was scheduled for October 13th and 14th, 2020 in Palm Beach County. We are expecting to have that event in 2021, again, hosted by Palm Beach County. We're looking at venues and dates, and of course would take the safety of our residents and community in mind when planning to make sure that that it's an appropriate time in 2021. We will be having some sort of virtual event in the fall of 2020 to not replace the climate summit, but supplement and connect with our community and talk about kind of where we are in the year and the state of the resilient state, if you will. So please keep in touch, and we'll be posting on the Office of Resilience Palm Beach County newsletter. We'll be linking to that event once it gets scheduled.
Thanks, Megan. I'll also complete answering Christina's question with, so in addition to what the compact is doing on the regional scale, that's actually how this, we're calling it a micro-regional collaboration, what Lindsay and Megan presented today. How it got started is because many of us were involved in the regional climate change compact, and while extremely valuable, it is very general, and some of the actions that are going on and discussions in Miami-Dade, the Keys, and Broward don't necessarily apply as directly here in Palm Beach County. And as Lindsay described, we came together to address our specific vulnerabilities and needs. And so that's the study that we're kicking off currently. We just started in April with our CCVA, and it goes through March of 2021. And so we're asking you all to stay involved, because we will be assessing vulnerabilities and developing specific recommendations for adaptations. And I hope that answers your question. So stay tuned, and that's exactly what we'll be working on. Does anyone want to add to that, to Christina's?
This is Megan again from Palm Beach County. You mentioned different climate action plans and mitigation plans. So I think you'll, when we're talking about specific actions related to mitigation, a lot of it is what cities in the county are doing that Olivia highlighted as potential solutions in her presentation, things like measuring greenhouse gas inventory, looking at electric vehicle pilots and encouraging that infrastructure, trying to promote solar through SolSmart, which is a DOE program to facilitate residential and business owner solar installation. Those are a few examples of things that the county is working on, and I know other jurisdictions are doing similar things. So that's on the mitigation side, as well as the adaptation work that Rebecca mentioned. The county is putting together its own kind of, we're calling it a resilience action plan that addresses both climate mitigation and adaptation. We are also working on our leadership in environmental and energy design LEED certification for the county as a whole, and that will give us a good assessment of what kind of sustainability initiatives we need to, where we are successful and what we need to pursue further.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, next question comes from Margaret Fitzsimmons. Hi, Margaret. Will your group be making these presentations to the leadership, both elected officials and internal city staff within each of our cities, and at the state leadership level as well? Great question. We have contracted CLEO Institute for 3 workshops, and this is the 3rd. So the first 2 we're doing just that, your first 2 groups there. Our first workshop was a mayor's roundtable, where we had 1 mayor or commissioner from each of the jurisdictions. And that was in March. And then in April, we had a very similar workshop to today that was targeting city staff within all of the participants. And we will keep the staff and of course the elected officials abreast of our progress through the vulnerability assessment and resilience plan that we're developing. State leadership, that's a great question. I don't have an immediate answer to that. Megan, do you have thoughts?
Sure. I mean, one thing the state has just done is passed Senate Bill 178, which is requiring state-funded projects to do a sea level implementation study or something that spells SLIP. I forget what it stands for, but it's similar to what many of the South Florida counties and cities are doing, where we're requiring projects to incorporate sea level rise projections into those resources and plan for that accordingly. So the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, as well as Palm Beach County, is interested in seeing how that goes and tracking that. There's also at the state with Commissioner Nikki Fried and DAX, and she put together the FACE, which is the Florida Advisory Council on Climate and Energy. And so that is a group of stakeholders from all over the state. I'm a member of that group, and we just had a call yesterday where we were reviewing the energy plan that her office put together specific to transportation. So we're going through section by section to talk about that energy plan and climate plan and see what kind of things we can do to further implement what she has started, as well as you know, that one of the first things Governor DeSantis did was appoint or create a position for a Chief Resilience Officer. We had Dr. Julia Neshwat fill that position for a little under a year, I believe, where she was meeting with all of the different sustainability and resilience leads throughout the state. She put together a draft resiliency plan. Unfortunately, she left that post to do some federal work, and so that position is now being temporarily held by DEP Secretary Valenstein, and so he's wearing many hats. But we are, you know, excited that that position exists, as well as the state put together. They, in addition to the Chief Resilience Officer, they created a Chief Scientist position with Dr. Frazier at a University of Florida to help really look into sea level rise and climate change. So those are a few state level actions that I've been excited to see.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, Megan, that some of those actions from the governor were really huge and really show that Florida governance is willing to take climate change seriously and accept that climate change is a reality, since Florida is one of the most, you know, vulnerable states. And that I think it's called the Florida Act, the one that you were just mentioning, where state buildings have to take into account sea level rise moving forward. It's called Act on Climate Florida. That was really one of the first major climate change bills that happened in Florida. So that's significant. And we, you know, even though we know that the state has to do a lot more, and it would be great if they could start implementing policies around, you know, moving toward renewable energy, we also do have to celebrate the wins that happen and, you know, keep setting the example at the city and county level, so that then the state can get on board and move the needle even further with climate change.
Yeah, and Paul Owen had a question too that was related to this, and what more could the state leaders be doing? So I think this speaks to what Olivia had just mentioned. I hope that we have a state greenhouse gas target at some point, so we all are unified in what we're trying to achieve, that a greenhouse gas reduction target, I should say. And I know they're working on an electric vehicle roadmap work right now, which is exciting. I'm interested in seeing how they promote smart growth and smart development, and especially in this post-COVID world where we're learning that we don't need to necessarily all commute 50 miles a day to work, and I'm interested in seeing what kind of policies emerge from that. So yeah, there's certainly, I think, implementing a lot of the climate and energy plan initiatives that Nikki Fried's office has set up would be a wonderful thing to see, and something that the leaders can further take on.
I'll just add one quick addition to that, which is that we are directly connected to the state in terms of what we're doing with this vulnerability assessment, because we've received funding twice in 2 rounds of the resilience planning grants that FDEP, the Florida Resilient Coastlines Program, is offering, and we'll, I'm sure, be applying for one of the next rounds when that comes up as well. It's great that they're offering this funding, and as a grantee, we're on the forums, we attend their webinars, and so we're staying in touch with the DEP and the Resilient Coastlines Program for opportunities and information. So moving on, we have a question from Chris Lockhart. Hello, Chris. And she says, will you be sharing some of what each city is doing for resilience and how local other groups and churches can support this? And yes, that's exactly what we are doing. With today's webinar, as I said, this is our first real engagement with community stakeholders as part of this Coastal Resilience Partnership. But we have more on the calendar, not on the calendar yet, but on our timeline. So we actually have Alec Bogdanoff on the call today, who is the outreach lead for our team of consultants with the climate change vulnerability assessment. And Alec is a local expert in climate science as well as in community outreach and engagement. And so he will be leading us through some additional stakeholder engagement in the coming months. I believe our next workshop or webinar will be probably in August sometime. So again, as I said, if you have specific local groups or organizations or individuals, please email us, any one of us, or just put it in the chat box here so we know who else to add to that list to be involved. Does anyone else have additions to make?
I just want to encourage everyone to go to those stakeholder workshops. If you're, if you work in an office, share it with other people that might be interested and the community. It's really important to get stakeholder feedback throughout these processes. So just encouraging people to take that time out of their day when the workshops occur to be an active participant in the process.
And then we'll also be putting together the CRP website that will link through the county resilience website, as well as a CRP outreach through that. So that's another way to get information about what each city is doing specific to the CRP. But the county also talks about other city efforts in our resilience newsletter.
Great. The next question is from Allison, and she asks, we live in a small apartment complex and I'm looking for ways to get, I don't have to read these because you can all see them, right? She asks about ways to learn about and invest in climate mitigation and sustainability initiatives, and where can we go for supporting information. Allison, I'm not sure what city or town you're in, but I would direct you first of all to, if your city or town has the cities in the region do have a sustainability coordinator, or if you're in unincorporated Palm Beach County, it's Megan's Office of Resilience. You could start with the Office of Resilience if you're not sure about your city or town, but I'll just say that Boynton Beach, Delray Beach, and Boca Raton all have full-time sustainability coordinator managers. So I would start with them because they can inform you about the specific incentives that the city may have, or requirements or specifics in their city codes that can help you out. Anything to add to that, Megan?
Yeah, I'd also say a lot of the nonprofits out there focused on energy efficiency are great resources for building the case for selling these ideas to your building association or property owners. So the Institute for Market Transformation is a nonprofit out of DC that works all over the country, and they support energy efficiency. So they have good resources on making the business case. ACEEE is another national nonprofit that discusses more at the policy level, but those are a couple off the top of my head. So yeah, if you reach out to your local offices, we can further direct you based on what you need.
For renewables specifically, you can look also to Solar United Neighbors, which is Florida Sun, and they host solar co-ops. We've had 2 in the county so far, and they have a lot of information on their website about going solar. Okay, we have a question from Chris about tree canopy. Will the tree canopy focus mostly on shade trees versus palms? Great question. I'll answer for Boynton Beach and Chris, I believe you're a resident of Boynton, if I remember correctly. In a week and a half, on June 15th, we're having another public input session for the city on our tree canopy assessment, because we're just finishing that up right now. And we are making the point in there that it is shade trees, not palms. Palms are actually called trees, but they're really more closely related to grasses. And I'm asking the consultants to emphasize that in our reports, because that's a very important education piece that we need. Palms, of course, have their purpose. People like them, they're aesthetic, they're what, iconic part of our subtropical climate, but they do not provide nearly the ecosystem services that canopy trees do. So our tree canopy goal that we're setting in the city of Boynton Beach, and we'll be bringing it to commission in July, is focused on canopy trees, and with a special emphasis on natives as much as possible. And I know that Delray Beach has also done a tree canopy assessment and is just now signing a contract with Community Greening, the nonprofit, to implement their tree planting campaign. Our city and Boca Raton also have partnerships with Community Greening. They're a fantastic organization. Check them out. They have volunteer opportunities, and they're winning all kinds of grants left and right. So we're really proud of our partnership with them. Lewis again asks, how are we ensuring input from vulnerable communities in the planning process? Great question. Again, in putting together the invite list for this webinar, we all tried to reach out to diverse communities within each of our jurisdictions. We'll look through the invite list or the attendee list, and I hope that we have succeeded to some extent at ensuring that we're representing all of our communities, but there's always more work to be done in that regard. So again, please make suggestions to us for specific people, community leaders, or groups that we should bring into the fold. And I also want to turn it over to Olivia, because she might have some specific, that's really CLEO's area of expertise as well. So
yeah, I think partnering with, local organizations, like you mentioned, community leaders that are on the ground, and making sure that information is shared in different ways. So not just email and social media, since a lot of our more vulnerable communities don't necessarily access those forms of media. Sometimes local radio stations can be really effective. We know that in Miami-Dade County, it's the case. So we try and advertise on those media sources as well. And of course, flyers where in local areas, in these neighborhoods where people can see these things, whether it's at the local laundromat or a local corner store. Like, we would drop off stacks of flyers, pin them on different community boards. So if you can get some of those leaders and organizations to help do that kind of community outreach for you, because I'm sure that you probably don't have the capacity, that would be a great way to getting the message out to a wider stakeholder group.
Next question from Ron. Hello, Ron. What are plans to engage more local residents to support specific policies and/or state legislation to support climate mitigation and adaptation? Well, I would direct residents to, again, to get involved at your city or county level with the representatives that are on this in this webinar today. In addition to that, there are a number of nonprofits, some of which we have already mentioned in terms of supporting specific policies. I'll give another shout out to Citizens Climate Lobby. Lewis is on the call. I know there are other CCL members on the call because somebody commented on HR, is it 763? Carbon fee and dividend policy, because that is Citizen Climate Lobby's sole purpose currently, is to promote carbon fee and dividend and ensure passage of that policy, which is so crucial to addressing climate mitigation, because we need to put a price on carbon to get to the source of the issue. Other groups, I'm sure you guys can maybe add to that. There's also Climate Reality, which is a great group to get involved in if you're interested in engaging and giving your own talks or just learning more and becoming an advocate.
Yeah, they have an online training coming up soon, and CLEO also offers the CLEO Speakers Network, where we train people, and we're doing all of our cohorts online now as a result of the pandemic. We have a cohort coming up in July. It's free of charge. I'll send that link in the follow-up email as well if you want to sign up on our general CLEO Speakers Network group.
Great. I also have a reminder here from Alec in the chat. Thanks, Alec, to just contact your state reps and senators and let them know this is an important issue for you, whether you do that as a volunteer for a group like CCL or just on your own, in your own words. Always, these days, more than ever, it's important to speak up and be part of the democratic process. Write letters to the editor. There's so much you can do and so many resources online to help.
Yeah, we also just completed a big push at the county level to encourage people to participate in the census, and that's another way to make sure that everyone countywide is being heard and counted and accounted for. So, you know, just broadly speaking, not necessarily specific to resiliency or climate change, but making sure we know and we're paying attention to our community. So hopefully everyone participated.
Okay, great. We have a comment here from Sarah with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. That's really cool, Sarah. So excited to hear that. Documenting impacts of climate change at cultural and historical sites. I would love to learn more about what your group is doing. As far as resources available to chat with volunteers, I think CLEO again is probably a great go-to resource for you. You have many more webinars coming up, is that right?
We do. We have more webinars that's on our event page. And again, I'll send that link. Sarah, you can reach out to me directly. I just sent you my email address. Anyone who's interested in emailing me, my email is olivia@cleoinstitute.org. If you have any questions, and my email is also going to be in the follow-up email from the webinar as well. So.
Okay, one more question here. Paul Nicholas asks regarding electric utility poles and storm resiliency. How soon will we see results of the study that may be used to support the state's DEO MIT grant funding? Ooh, do you mean our vulnerability study? I suppose. I can answer that. Would be March 2021 is our timeline. Just to reiterate, Lindsay went through the study a little bit, but we are on, we have a 5-step process. We are completing the first 2 steps this month, which were to identify which climate threats we're focusing on, and that's the list of 12 that Lindsay showed. And step 2 is to identify the assets. As far as electric utility poles, we don't have authority over those as cities and the county, and there's been some discussion of including electric infrastructure in our vulnerability assessment, but we are not confident or certain that we can get that information from Florida Power and Light. So I would, oh, City of Lake Worth Beach. Okay, yes, for City of Lake Worth Beach, which controls their own utility, that the utility will be included. So the answer then would be March. And it's a quick answer. March 2021, we should have, well, actually, if you need it sooner, we will be completing the 3rd phase. Alec, maybe you want to pop in with a, remind me of the timeline, but I believe in the fall. And the 3rd phase of our project is to complete the vulnerability assessment. The 4th and 5th phases are to go into the adaptation strategies and prioritizing. So I think fall is probably a reasonable, yes, and Alec concurs, end of the year. Does that answer your question? Okay, let's see, we're at 11:30, which is about what we expected. We did not intend to take a full 2 hours of your time, but if there are any additional questions, we're happy to take a few more. think we're wrapping up. Were there any in the chat that I missed, you guys? I was going through the Q&A list.
I don't think so. I took a look, but I didn't see anything.
All right. Well, great. Thank you all. I'll let Olivia and Megan take it from here.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for being on today's webinar. Again, it's a pleasure for CLEO to partner on this collaboration. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to field them. My email will be in the follow-up email. And when you close your webinar, you're going to get a survey. We highly encourage you to fill that out. It only takes a few minutes. That'll also be in the follow-up email that you get along with the recording of the webinar. So thanks for all your great questions, and I look forward to further collaboration in the future. Megan?
Yes, thank you all. This was a great Q&A session, and appreciate you all working with us on the virtual option in lieu of an in-person conversation. But thank you for keeping the dialogue, for staying engaged. We know that what we're working on is for you all and our communities. So we really appreciate you coming in and showing up, and please reach out to us with any further questions. We are here for you. Thank you.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everyone.